The entire restaurant held its breath the moment she stood her ground. It wasn't because she was being loud, it was because she was being dangerously calm. In a room where men like Mi Beom-Seok ruled with shadows and fear, a waitress had just demanded something even his money couldn't buy. The air in the restaurant was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the unspoken rules of the city's elite. It was a place of quiet power, where the clink of silverware was the only sound permitted to break the hushed deals being made in the corners. Bridget D. Nordman moved through the dining room like a ghost of perfection. Straight-backed and professional, she carried herself with a dignity that disguised the weight on her shoulders. She was more than just a server, she was a lifeline. Every shift was a step toward her brother's college tuition, and every table was a brick in the foundation of the family home she was determined to save. She had spent years perfecting the art of being unflappable, burying her own pride to ensure her family's future. But tonight, at the center table, the arrival of a man in a navy suit was about to push that professional mask to its breaking point. Mi Beom-Seok had arrived, and he wasn't looking for a meal, he was looking for a target. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open, and for a split second, the natural rhythm of the room stuttered. It wasn't a loud entrance, there was no shouting, no dramatic flair. Instead, it was the sheer weight of the presence that entered. Mi Beom-Seok stepped into the soft amber glow of the foyer, his navy suit so dark it looked like a bruise against the cream-colored walls. He didn't wait to be greeted. He moved with the slow, predatory confidence of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. Bridget felt the shift before she saw him. The air grew thin, and the low hum of conversation from the surrounding tables died down into a strained, artificial whisper. She smoothed her apron, her fingers grazing the small notebook in her pocket. She had heard the stories, everyone in the city had. Beom-Seok was a man of shadows, a leader of a world that didn't play by the rules of the light. Table 4, the maitre d' whispered, his voice uncharacteristically tight as he caught Bridget's eye. "He's yours, Bridget. Be careful." She nodded once, a sharp, professional gesture, and stepped forward. As she approached, she saw the details up close, the pristine white shirt, the razor-sharp fold of his pocket square, and eyes that held the cold, flat stillness of a frozen lake. He didn't look up as she arrived. He simply stared at the menu as if it were a document he was preparing to dismantle. "Good evening, Mr. Mi," Bridget said, her voice a perfect anchor of calm in the rising sea of tension. "Welcome to the Gilded Rose. My name is Bridget, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." He didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, a power move designed to make anyone else fidget or stammer. He finally looked up, his gaze raking over her uniform, then her face, with a calculated indifference that felt like a challenge. He didn't see a person, he saw a service. "Ice water," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate the crystal on the table. "And don't make me ask for it twice." Bridget maintained her posture, her expression a mask of professional grace even as her pulse quickened. The game had begun, and the stakes were far higher than a simple dinner service. The ice water was only the beginning. For the next hour, Table 4 became a private theater of psychological warfare. Mi Beom-Seok didn't just dine, he orchestrated a series of impossible hurdles, testing the structural integrity of Bridget's professional mask. First, it was the temperature of the room, too cold for his liking, then too warm the moment she adjusted the climate control. Then came the wine. He ordered a vintage that was notoriously difficult to breathe, only to swirl it once and claim the bouquet was bruised by her pouring technique. Each time Bridget returned to the table, the air seemed to thicken, the background chatter of the other diners fading into a static hum of nervous observation. Beom-Seok played with his steak knife, the polished steel catching the light as he watched her work. "The sauce," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky register. "It lacks the precision I was promised. Take it back. Tell the chef it is a milligram too heavy on the reduction." It was a demand designed to be refused, a blatant attempt to force a crack in her composure. Bridget knew the reduction was perfect. She also knew that the chef's ego was as sharp as his knives. To take it back was to invite a storm from the kitchen. To refuse was to give the man in the navy suit the excuse he needed to destroy her. She didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, not out of submission, but to ensure he saw the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. Of course, Mr. Me. We strive for nothing less than your definition of precision. She whisked the plate away before he could add another barb. As she moved toward the kitchen, her mind raced toward the ledger in her head, the mortgage payment, the chemistry textbook her brother needed, the looming utility bill. She used those numbers as a shield, a way to transmute his cruelty into a simple math problem. He was trying to prove he could break her spirit. She was simply trying to ensure her family's survival. She returned minutes later with a fresh plate, her movements so fluid they bordered on the hypnotic. She set it down with a click of ceramic on wood that sounded like a gavel. Beom-Seok looked at the food, then up at her, a slow, predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He hadn't broken her yet, but the night was young, and he was just getting started. The tension that had been simmering at table 4 finally boiled over during the dessert course. It started with a placement. A silver spoon laid a fraction of an inch out of alignment, or perhaps it was the way the steam rose from the espresso. To anyone else, the service was a masterclass in precision, but to Mi Beom-Seok, it was the opening he had been waiting for. I told you, he began, his voice no longer a rasp but a sharp, cutting blade that sliced through the restaurant's carefully curated silence. I do not tolerate incompetence. He stood up abruptly, the heavy velvet chair screeching against the parquet floor like a dying animal. The sound was so jarring that conversation at every other table ceased instantly. Diners froze with forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting toward the center of the room. Beom-Seok loomed over Bridget, his navy-clad frame casting a long, oppressive shadow across her white apron. You think because you hide behind that mask of professionalism, I can't see the disrespect in your eyes? He hissed. He raised his hand, a sharp, sudden gesture mid-air as if he were about to strike the space between them or sweep the entire table setting onto the floor. Look at me when I am speaking to you. The restaurant went cold. The air felt heavy, charged with the lethal unpredictability of a man who was used to people trembling at his slightest movement. The maitre d' took a step forward, his face pale, but he stopped when he saw Bridget's posture. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. As Beom-Seok's hand remained suspended in that aggressive, pleading arc of dominance, Bridget narrowed her gaze. She didn't look at the hand, she looked directly into the frozen lake of his eyes. The unflappable server was gone, replaced by a woman who had spent a lifetime calculating costs, and she had just decided that this man's ego was a debt she was no longer willing to service. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick, until the only thing audible was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Bridget took a slow, deliberate breath, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed the professional mask to drop, revealing the steel beneath. Bridget didn't lower her gaze, and she didn't step back. The silence that followed Beom-Seok's outburst was so absolute it felt physical, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. She looked at the hand he had raised, that mid-air gesture of a man used to striking down obstacles, and then she looked back into his eyes with a terrifyingly calm clarity. Mr. Me, she began, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the hushed dining room. I have spent 3 years in this building perfecting the art of being invisible so that men like you can feel powerful. I have mastered your menus, anticipated your moods, and swallowed your insults because I have people at home who depend on me. Beom-Seok's hand wavered, his fingers twitching as the pleading tension in his expression deepened. He looked less like a predator now and more like a man who had suddenly hit a wall he couldn't see. But professionalism is a contract, Bridget continued, her posture as straight as a spear. I provide you with excellence, you provide me with the basic courtesy due to any human being. My job description includes service, not subservience. It includes efficiency, not endurance of abuse. If you require an emotional punching bag to enjoy your meal, then you are not looking for a server, you are looking for a victim. And I am not for sale. She took a single step closer, closing the distance he had used to intimidate her. The background diners watched, mesmerized, as the hierarchy of the room inverted. The waitress in the dark uniform was the only one with any real authority left. You may own the shadows of this city, and you may have a seat at every table of power, she whispered, though her words felt like thunder in the stillness. But you do not own the right to speak to me that way. Now, you can finish your dinner in silence, or I can walk away and leave you to explain to this room why a billionaire is so afraid of a woman who simply asked for respect. She stopped, her chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. For the first time in his life, the man who controlled the city found himself without a comeback. The room remained breathless, waiting for the storm to break. The silence that followed was heavy, vibrating with the ghost of Bridget's words. Every eye in the room was fixed on Mi Beom-Seok, expecting a volcanic eruption, a signal to his men, or the cold, final dismissal that usually preceded a disappearance. But as the seconds ticked by, the storm in his eyes didn't break, it transformed. The rigid, aggressive line of his shoulders began to soften. His raised hand, which had looked like a weapon moments before, lowered slowly, the fingers curling in a gesture that was no longer threatening, but almost searching. He looked at Bridget, really looked at her, not as a fixture of the restaurant or a target for his boredom, but as a force of nature. A strange, quiet light entered his gaze, replacing the frozen stillness of the lake with a flickering, pleading curiosity. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by yes men and terrified subordinates, only to finally encounter a truth he couldn't intimidate. The tension in his face shifted from anger to a profound, intrigued confusion. You speak of contracts, Beom-Seok said, his voice barely a whisper, yet audible in the vacuum of the room. He didn't sound like a mafia boss, he sounded like a student of a language he was hearing for the first time. Most people in this city sell their dignity before I even ask for it. They offer it up for a favor, for a fraction of what I spend on this wine. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his expression now one of intense, almost hungry interest. The fear in the room began to transmute into a bewildered fascination. You are standing there, knowing who I am, knowing what I could do to your career with a single phone call, he continued, his eyes searching hers for even a flicker of hesitation. And yet, you would walk away. You would choose a clean conscience over a paycheck. Why? Bridget didn't waver. Because a paycheck can be replaced, Mr. Me. But once you let someone see you as less than a person, you never quite see yourself the same way again. I have a brother to raise. I won't teach him how to be a servant, I'll teach him how to be a man. I can't do that if I come home every night smelling of the pride I swallowed. Beom-Seok sat back, a slow, genuine smile, devoid of mockery, spreading across his face. Incredible, he breathed. A lion's heart in a house of glass. The silence that followed was no longer cold. It was expectant. Mi Beom-Seok reached into the breast pocket of his navy jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. The restaurant held its collective breath, half expecting a weapon or a payoff meant to buy her silence. Instead, he produced a heavy, matte black card with nothing but a gold-embossed emblem and a direct phone number. He didn't leave it on the table. He held it out toward her, waiting for her to accept it. I have a dozen men who would die for me because they fear what happens if they don't, Beom-Seok said, his voice regaining its low, commanding resonance. But I have no one who will tell me the truth when I am wrong. I have 100 employees in my hospitality and logistics divisions who bow their heads and let the profits leak through their fingers because they are too terrified to challenge the status quo. They have skills, but they do not have your spine. Bridget looked at the card, then back at the man. The predatory edge in his eyes had been replaced by a sharp, professional hunger. He wasn't looking for a server anymore, he was looking for a partner. "This is not a tip for your service tonight," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "This is an invitation. My legitimate holdings are in chaos because they are run by people who are afraid of their own shadows. I need someone who understands that excellence requires boundaries. I need a chief of staff who can look a lion in the eye and tell him his claws are dull." He leaned closer, the pleading curiosity in his expression settling into a firm challenge. "You are working here to save a home and a future. Keep the card. Call that number tomorrow morning. You'll find that the salary I'm offering makes these tips look like pocket change, and more importantly, you will never have to swallow your pride for a paycheck again. You won't be serving the table, Bridget. You'll be sitting at the head of it." For a moment, the weight of her reality, the bills, the long nights, the exhaustion, seemed to lift. She reached out and took the card. The cardstock was thick and cool, a physical manifestation of a door opening where there had only been a wall. Beom-Seok nodded once, a gesture of genuine peer-to-peer respect, then stood up and walked toward the exit without looking back. The room remained silent until the doors closed behind him, leaving Bridget standing in the center of the light, the black card clutched firmly in her hand. The transition from the polished floors of the restaurant to the glass-walled corridors of Beom-Seok's corporate headquarters was a shift in geography, but not in spirit. Bridget traded her server's apron for tailored blazers, yet she kept the same iron-fisted grace that had defined her for years. She arrived at the hospitality division not as an outsider, but as a seasoned veteran who knew exactly where the rot was hidden. She began by walking the front lines of his hotels and resorts, unnoticed and unassuming, watching the way managers treated their staff when they thought no one was looking. She saw the same patterns she had survived, the casual dismissal of hard work, the siphoning of resources, and the culture of fear that Beom-Seok's reputation had inadvertently fostered. With the black card now serving as her badge of absolute authority, she began the cleanup. In the boardroom, Bridget was a revelation. She didn't rely on complex jargon or empty corporate platitudes. Instead, she presented the hard math of human dignity. She fired 3 regional directors in her first month, not for lack of profit, but for lack of character. She showed the remaining executives that a terrified staff was an inefficient one, and that true luxury couldn't be faked by people who were being treated like machines. Beom-Seok often watched from the back of the room, silent and observant, as Bridget dismantled years of toxic tradition. She spoke with a clarity that cut through the typical boardroom noise, her voice never rising, her gaze never wavering. She implemented new training protocols that prioritized mutual respect, and she restructured the pay scales to ensure that the people on the bottom were no longer living on the edge of a cliff. By the end of the first quarter, the hospitality division wasn't just more profitable, it was transformed. The lion's heart Beom-Seok had seen in the restaurant was now the beating heart of his company. Bridget had taken the chaos of his legitimate holdings and organized it with the same precision she had once used to set a Michelin-starred table. She was no longer just protecting a family home, she was building an empire where no one had to smell of the pride they had swallowed. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a corner office that overlooked the city's skyline. Bridget sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, the black card that had once been her lifeline now framed discreetly on a bookshelf behind her. The frantic mental math of survival had been replaced by the strategic calculations of a leader. Her brother's first semester tuition was paid in full, and just that morning, she had received a photo of him standing in front of his university library, a wide, confident smile on his face. A smile that was no longer shadowed by the fear of their home being lost. A rhythmic knock at the door preceded the arrival of Mi Beom-Seok. He no longer entered rooms with the intent to stifle the air, instead, there was a grounded, mutual gravity between them. He carried 2 coffees, setting one on her desk with a nod that had become their silent shorthand for respect. The navy suits remained, but the sharp, predatory edge in his eyes had mellowed into a keen, professional alertness. The quarterly reports from the hospitality division are in, Mi Beom-Seok said, taking a seat opposite her. He didn't loom, he sat as an equal. Employee retention is at an all-time high, and for the first time in 5 years, we aren't seeing shrinkage in the inventory. It turns out people don't steal from a company that actually sees them. Bridget took a sip of her coffee, her gaze meeting his with the same unflinching clarity she had found that night at the restaurant. People don't protect what they don't value, me. We gave them a stake in their own dignity. The profit is just a byproduct of that. Mi Beom-Seok leaned back, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. He was no longer just the man who controlled the shadows, he was a businessman who had learned that true power wasn't found in a raised hand, but in a raised standard. They were no longer boss and subordinate, nor predator and prey. They were partners in an empire built on the radical idea that excellence and empathy could occupy the same boardroom. As they turned their attention to the next expansion project, the silence between them was no longer a weapon, it was the quiet, steady hum of a shared vision. The evening air was cool as Bridget stood on the balcony of her office, looking out over the city that once felt like a labyrinth of closed doors. In the distance, the neon pulse of the theater district blurred into the steady glow of the residential blocks, but her mind drifted back to a different kind of light, the dim, amber hum of the restaurant where her life had split into before and after. She thought about the silence. Not the comfortable, collaborative silence she shared with Mi Beom-Seok now, but that heavy, suffocating vacuum that had filled the dining room the moment she refused to be small. For years, she had believed that her value lay in her ability to remain quiet, to absorb the friction of the world without making a sound. She had mistaken endurance for strength, thinking that by swallowing her words, she was protecting her future. But as she watched the city lights, she realized that the silence of that night hadn't been an end, it had been a clearing. By refusing to let a billionaire's voice drown out her own, she had claimed a space that no one could ever take back. Her voice hadn't just filled the room, it had filled the hollow places in her own spirit. She was no longer a woman defined by what she could tolerate, but by what she refused to accept. She turned back to her desk, catching her reflection in the glass. The woman looking back was the same one who had carried the heavy silver trays, but the weight was gone. She had taught her brother that dignity wasn't a luxury reserved for the powerful, it was the foundation upon which everything else was built. The room went silent that night because the world wasn't used to hearing the truth from someone it deemed invisible. But as Bridget picked up her coat and prepared to head home, to a house that was finally, truly hers, she knew she would never be invisible again. The silence was over, and in its place was a life built on her own terms, spoken in her own voice, and anchored by a heart that had never once flinched.